Hey guys, currently traveling at the moment, and I've got a doozy for you here. Looking at a peculiar cycle. Honestly, I think they're all peculiar, but this one has some direct links to a lot of religious texts, including the ancient Hebrew texts, the Christian Bible, and probably a bunch of others. It's a very peculiar pattern of what is known as the Sabbath year. I'm going to be using the Dow Jones Industrial Average, looking at daily data for the entire length of its history. So that's back to 1885 to do our analysis. So this is what I'm going to start out with. I take that entire history of the Dow Jones Industrial Average, I detrend the data, and then split it up into consecutive 7-year segments. That is what you see here. I've plotted it all out on one chart. So each line represents a 7-year slice. What I've actually done here is average out a bunch of different historical periods. You can see them in the left-hand panel. So there are 5 lines. The 4 thin ones correspond to these histories. So you see each one is longer than the one before. And the thick line is an average across the entire time series. So what do you think when you see this chart? Do you think this is generated by a random process? The answer is obviously no. This is random. You'd expect this to look like an absolute mess. But this is telling you there is a definitive pattern that the Dow has been tracing out, right? We're talking about historical data. It's not a guarantee that that's what we'll see in the future, but the Dow has been tracing out a very definitive pattern over 7 years. So, in fact, we'll do some statistical analysis on it. This is an output from a walk-forward efficiency test, and what it is telling us essentially is that out of 17 of these 7-year slices, in only 3 did we see the pattern deviate from what we see here. In all the others, that's all these red blocks, right? Each block represents 7 years. The pattern was pretty close or very close to what you see in this visual. Okay? And this is something I pay attention to a heck of a lot in my research. If I find cycles with very high walk forward efficiency test, that is something that is going into my toolbox, something I want to pay attention to because we're reaching this via walk forward analysis. And it suggests that it is a useful tool for forecasting should the future be a representation of the past, if history repeats itself, so on and so forth. Another take on this. Check this out. That's the Dow showing data back to 2010. Of course, we're using data all the way back to 1885, but this just to make a point on how I'm constructing another visual that you may find interesting. These lines, these zigzag lines, are a way to pick out turning points. And what I've defined here as a turning point is any extreme which is preceded by or followed by a move that is a minimum of 15% in magnitude. Minimum 15%, right? So we can call these 15% turning points. And I want to focus on the bottoms, right? These 15% bottoms. Identify all of them for the entire, whatever it is, almost 140 years of history that we have of daily data on the Dow. Once I've identified those 15% bottoms, I strip out the dates. Right, so imagine I've got all those dates for that 140-year history on one line. I then go and split it into consecutive 7-year periods. Each period, I take that 7 years, turn it into a circle. Right, my 7 years, or 7-year circumference, and I've got a circle. Now I start going along my circle and I mark every point, every time, all the dates that I had, a 15% bottom. Then I bring in my second 7-year segment and I do the same thing. I keep doing it, and over time, I'm just going to have this one circle with many different markings showing me every time that a 15% bottom occurred. What will that look like? Probably something like this. Bit of a mess, but you'll see where we're going. Once we have this, you can probably see the beginnings of what could be a clustering analysis, a technique that is used a lot in statistical analysis and machine learning. We're not going to be doing anything complicated. We're just going to produce a visual. You can already see that this highlighted bit, this half of the circle, has a higher density of these 15% bottoms, these turning points, relative to the other half. And in fact, if you focused on this quarter here, you would see that it has a much higher density than any of the other quarters do. And that is, of course, hinting that perhaps there is a pattern worth paying attention to here. The next thing I do is split it up into 10-degree segments and then effectively turn all these points into a 360-degree histogram. What does that look like? Boom. It gives us another dimension to the visualization that begins to show a bit of that pattern. Right now, you see where we are today. Today's date equates to 194 degrees on this circle that we've created. I have added to the outer circumference the future dates that align with these 30-degree divisions. So, if history were to repeat itself, all I'm trying to identify is what I call hot zones. What are those zones in that pattern that we identified before, in which historically these 15% bottoms have occurred most? And we have them highlighted here. Now, my subscribers, you want to pay attention to those dates in the context of all the discussions we've had regarding our longer term cycles. Right? Some of those will start leaping out. Let's take a look at some of the, let's call them the lukewarm zones. All right, look at this. April 2026. We'll probably want to pay attention to that, given the discussions we've had about our medium-term cycles. There's something towards the year end of 2027. But in the really hot zones, we're looking at October 28, October 29. That's also around October of 2030. Still a long way off, but again, being a long-term subscriber, there are things to pay attention to in that regard. So what exactly is the Sabbath year? Or as I've written here, it's known in Hebrew as the Shemitah cycle. If you do a quick search on Google, you'll get this summary from Gemini. Shemitah year, also known as sabbatical year, is a 7-year agricultural cycle in Judaism, when the land is left to rest and other economic and agricultural adjustments are made, including letting the land rest, debts are forgiven, etc., etc. I mean, amazing practices, the kind of stuff you wish happened, well, anywhere really. I'm not sure if that still happens anywhere in the world. The central part of the Jewish cycle of time is discussed, well, it's discussed everywhere. The word literally means release. And look at this here, guys. The next Shemitah year will be in 2028 to 2029. And have a think back to the previous Shemitah years, which line up with those hot zones. Do you remember what happened in 2022? Do you remember what happened in 2015? Especially around August and towards the end of the year. Do you remember what happened in 2008? Do you remember 2001? Do you remember 94? 1987? So on and so forth. That is exactly what's creating that pattern we looked at before. If you prefer the Christian Bible, look at this from Exodus. 6 years thou shalt sow the land, 7th year rest. So is the market, is the Dow Jones resting every 7th year? So here's a look at what that detrended oscillator looks like. It's an overlay on the Dow Jones Industrial Average. So remember that bear market, 2022. Look at that in 2015, 2008. That even included 9/11, I believe, 2001. So most of the time, you'll see that that period every 7 years lines up with some sort of bear market. Sometimes a really nasty bear market. So let's focus on the future, guys. Right? Because currently, this is where we are in terms of this pattern. This has been identified as the really hot zone, right? The actual Shemitah year itself, 2028 into 2029. We know we've got a lukewarm zone over here, all the way into maybe April of 2026. So, if this pattern were to hold, if the Shemitah cycle were to hold, as we've seen, it's got a walk forward efficiency of over 80%, right? Only 3 out of those 17 periods where that pattern failed. So if that pattern holds, what does it mean? Does it mean we're going to have a mega bear market in 2025 to 2026? Will we have a mega bear market from around 2027 to 2029? Well, here's another little trick we can utilize. We can take the actual price data, so not just the detrended oscillator as we have here in the background, we'll take the actual price data that corresponds to those 7-year slices. We could take all of them, line them up to the current time, and see the different types of scenarios that have occurred in the past that led to this pattern. Like so. Actually, I haven't used all of them because it starts looking a bit messy, but in general, you can see what led to this pattern we see over here. Generally, the market here has some form of correction. Sometimes it was just a slowdown. You see this pink line just goes sideways, and then the market was strong again. Or it had a sharp pullback, and then it was strong again. Up into possibly a more important peak, and then you generally had a pretty large decline. You can take all those and average them out. And this is what you get. So this is a potential future, a potential out of so many futures we could have, right? A potential future which involves a continuation of the bull markets into, say, early 2025, and then a period of slowdown, a consolidation, which would kind of make sense. Some sort of consolidation against this very strong uptrend we've had since October of 2022. Of course, it could be a sharper pullback, but some sort of consolidation, some sort of slowdown, some sort of correction. And then a resumption of the bull market up until some other peak, who knows when, later this decade, but then a pretty tough end to the decade, right? We have that Shemitah year, the Sabbath year, from around October, which is New Year's, October of 2028 to October 2029. That is what would happen if history were to repeat. So subscribers, think of that in the context of the important long-term cycles we have been discussing for so long. Now, astute readers will immediately notice the very simple relationship between the Shemitah cycle, and the kitchen cycle. Shemitah cycle is 7 years, period of 7 years. What is the period of the kitchen cycle? Well, it's 42 months, right? So it is half. In other words, double the frequency. For the musicians, it's the same note, but just 1 octave apart. And in fact, if I add in the kitchen cycle in there, boom, there you have it. 42 months. So it seems that the additional cycle, the Shemitah cycle, the additional information it is giving us is that the kitchen cycle beats alternate. there's some sort of alternating pattern to them. And I can't say it's a definite one that you should absolutely bet the farm on, but it seems to be that there is some sort of alternation. You have major beats every other beat, whilst you have minor ones. The minor ones is where the market sort of consolidates, goes mostly sideways. There's still sharp corrections, but mostly goes sideways. Whereas the major ones are when you get, or when we have had, larger bear markets. So perhaps that is what we're kind of looking at. Minor beat into 26, major beat later part of this decade. And you can possibly see here why I'm always writing and talking about the kitchen cycle. Right? When we look at so many economic time series, kitchen cycle is always popping up. And it also is one of those that has a weird link to religious texts, believe it or not. It may blow your mind. The religious text that I know best is the Christian Bible, and the kitchen cycle, or the period of the kitchen cycle, is mentioned 7 times in the Christian Bible. 3 times in the book of Daniel, 4 times in the book of Revelations. That is just freakish. Okay, that for me it freaks me out a bit. Not in a bad way. Check this out. This is now the spectral density using all the entire history of the Dow Jones Industrial Average, monthly data from 1790. 1790. That is a heck of a lot of data, guys. We're talking about what, almost 140 years or so of data? And it shows you, look at the major peaks from that statistical analysis. 3.5 years, 42 months. That is the kitchen cycle. That is the dominant cycle. It's only a dominant medium term cycle. And the long end, here we have it, the land cycle. In the middle here, we have the Euclid cycle. Put a star there because there's a lot more to it here. You can actually see there are 2 peaks. If you go to Wikipedia and you look up economic cycles, you'll see these guys coming up. The ones I think that are most important for anyone who's interested, kitchen cycle, because that's our important medium-term cycle. The land cycle, absolutely important. Right. If you want to understand the land cycle a lot more, guys, there's a very nice little video. I'm going to link it here on YouTube to get a bit more information from that. But I think that's enough for today. Good luck out there.